Hi, everybody. Welcome to this new World VFX Day session. I'm Ian Fales from Befores and Afters, and I'm joined by Paul Franklin. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hello, Ian. I'm great. Lovely to be here. Lovely to speak to you on the other side of the world.
Yes, I'm in Sydney. Paul's in London. If you don't know Paul Franklin, he's obviously a long-time VFX supervisor, creative director at DNEG, but now also a director in his own right, which must be an interesting change for you, Paul.
Yeah, it's you suddenly realise that all the problems you may have had as a visual effects supervisor, the director has more problems.
Oh, well, that's interesting to hear. We're going to talk about something which I think is a really nice kind of spin on World VFX Day. We're going to talk about iconic VFX moments in history. And I
Mhm.
think in some ways, Paul, these are more moments that possibly inspired your own career.
Yes,
Again, if people don't know, Paul's an Oscar winner for Interstellar and Inception and a nominee for The Dark Knight. So you've had a lot of history with visual effects, but we're
yes.
going to sort of almost not debate, but walk through some of these iconic, top moments in recent VFX history. We're not going to start at the beginning in the late 1800s, I think, Paul,
No.
but we could another time.
No, absolutely. No, I mean, I guess that's a sort of oblique reference to the fact that visual effects have been part of cinema right since the beginning of cinema.
Mm.
Trick photography, stop motion, using matte paintings and models have always been part of visual effects. I guess I'm lucky enough that I started my career in visual effects when digital was just beginning its ascendancy and taking the lead position over the optical techniques that we'd used for many decades. When I say we, I mean the film industry. I wasn't a filmmaker even in the 1980s. I was an art student. Um, and so I have a real interest in the way that visual effects has developed over the years. And I guess really though, for the modern industry, everything changes with Star Wars and Close Encounters
Yeah.
of the Third Kind in the 1970s, because that's a point at which all those optical techniques I was talking about that you see in all these amazing films from the 50s and 60s and 70s, they are now being combined with the emergence of computer technology, which is being used to control the movements of the cameras. It's not being used to make the images yet. There's a little bit of computer graphics in Star Wars, but not a lot. The original Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, as I believe it is now called. And I'm old enough to still call it Star Wars. But this new computer control, motion control that was developed for that film, made an enormous difference in terms of the quality and the sophistication of the effects that could be made. And so suddenly, visual effects, those two films elevate visual effects from something that was kind of part of slightly hokey, were considered to be B movie films because the visual effects never looked that convincing. It took it right to the top of the A list and
Mm.
changed cinema. There's all other things that factored into that, but that jump in quality and the ability of
Mm.
filmmakers to tell these incredible stories now with this effects work changed altogether. Obviously, there was a sort of a precursor to that was 2001 back in the
Mm.
1960s, which is an amazing film and is a real landmark in visual effects. But the dynamism of Star Wars wasn't possible with the technology of 2001, and that makes all the difference. And then there are other things that happen along the way, but that is a kind of real extraordinary moment where everything changes.
Yeah. And I know the answer to this, but tell people who might not realize what that computer controlled camera movement and platform movement, motion control,
Yes.
what did that let George Lucas actually do? What did it mean for the shots on screen, the
Well, it
spaceships,
meant
and the
that
compositing as well?
if you think of the attack on the Death Star, an iconic sequence, it meant that he could design and shoot that sequence as if he was shooting a World War II fighter plane movie, where you might use real air to air photography of planes doing incredible stunts. And now you could get the models to do the same sort of thing. So you think about Luke Skywalker shooting along the Death Star trench being chased by Darth Vader. None of that was possible before this technology came along. At the same time, there was a refinement in the compositing process, the way that you put images together, add all the different layers together.
Mm.
And the folks who did Star Wars, they used a format, resurrected an old filmmaking format called VistaVision, which is a medium format photography format, which gives you much more resolution than standard 35mm film. And this meant that as they added layers and layers to the images, and they printed down eventually to the 35 anamorphic print, they maintained the quality of the image. So the image cut very beautifully back to back with the camera original first generation stuff, the live action stuff inside the spacecraft. So you didn't get that weird separation in quality, which I think was a hallmark of a lot of visual effects work before that. And these things, as I say, combined together, raised the level of the effects work to a point where you just believe it. You just fell into that film when you went to watch it. I went to see it when I was 11 years old, and it's
Mm.
a pivotal moment because I'd never seen anything like it, which was so exciting, and you felt like you were inside that world, that universe. And we've only really just built on that since then.
Yeah. I mean, it obviously heralded the arrival of ILM,
Mm,
and then throughout the rest of the Star Wars trilogy, there were just incredible leaps and bounds made mostly in optical, practical, puppet, but
yes.
also motion control technology. And what I really love is that, ILM was this leader, but the other companies grew up and out of ILM,
Mhm,
Apogee and
yeah.
Boss. And there was this amazing optical dogs. I like when they talk about optical dogs kind of period of visual effects, wasn't there,
Yes.
for much of the late 70s and 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. And throughout the 80s, you have a refinement of that process. And there's a famous shot in Return of the Jedi, which is what was that 1982, I think, or is it 83? I can't quite remember.
Might be
It's
83.
82, 83. I think I was about 17 when it came out. And there's a shot where you see a vast armada of spacecraft, TIE fighters, and what have you, flying at the screen. And there's so many layers in it. And that wasn't possible at the time when they made Star Wars. I'm not sure how many layers the maximum level of compositing had in Star Wars, but it's nothing like that. But
Mm.
that's a refinement of technique, and so that's improving on the optical techniques that have been created for Star Wars and Close Encounters, and taking them to their limit. And throughout the 80s, you have essentially, as I say, a refinement of that process. There are amazing things in, for instance, Back to the Future. There was a very clever split screen process called VistaGlide, which uses the VistaVision format and allows you to basically window into the image and then move the frame around, so you can have those great shots where Biff meets his younger self or Marty meets his younger self, and the camera seems to be moving effortlessly and they're seamlessly spliced together. And that is, it's an amazing effect. It really holds up today because it's done at such
Mm.
high resolution. But by the end of the 80s, you're beginning to see actual digital graphics making more and more of an inroad into the visual effects process. And I guess the other kind of two pivotal moments, or at least big sort of flags, which went up to us in the industry, or those of us who were interested in visual effects, I wasn't in the industry, were Tron in
Yes.
1982, and then also the second Star Trek movie, The Wrath of Khan, which
Yes.
features this. I love it, the Genesis bomb sequence, which is just filmed off a television screen, and they even have to frame it with a bit of console either side of it because they can't make it into a CinemaScope ratio.
Mm.
But the creativity and the invention that went into those films, again, those sequences still hold up because of the creativity is driving them, and so they transcend the technology. At the same time, they're doing things that just weren't possible with the available technology, optical technology at the time. So when you see that amazing shot in Tron where the camera drops down over the light cycle grid and the light cycles zoom past you, it's both. On one hand, it feels unreal. It has a sort of very graphic, cartoony look, but the camera is moving with such precision and the perspective is so accurate that it feels real. It feels like you're in a real space. It's like an early version of virtual reality where you go into a very simple, blocky universe, but it's moving with all the correct parallax as you move around it. So you buy it, and those two films laid down a marker saying, well, you can do these things. Neither film was the Tron film was not a huge financial success. So
No.
for a while, people were wary about doing this, and even then, we had that sort of backlash of like, oh, CGI isn't proper effects work. There was a sort of
Mm.
reaction against it. But by the end of the 80s, you get something like The Abyss, where The Abyss
Mm.
features that fantastic moment, the pseudopod, the watery tentacle that comes out. And I think that's the first time that we really get a photorealistic image being created in the film. There's also Young Sherlock Holmes, which had the glass knight that appears as well,
Yeah,
which is
and of
also
course, both of
very
those
cool.
films are ILM.
Yeah,
Well, Wrath of
absolutely.
Khan was kind of this mix of what Lucasfilm was doing digitally, and then
Yes.
eventually sort of became Pixar.
Yeah, it
But
was
ILM was obviously on that film.
Wrath of
But
Khan was
then,
Alvy Ray Smith's little unit, which then got hived off and eventually became the heart of Pixar.
yes,
So,
and Young Sherlock Holmes was ILM, and of course,
mm,
Abyss was.
yes.
And isn't it amazing that there was this sort of 1, 2, 3 hit from ILM of Abyss, Terminator 2, and Jurassic Park at the time? What's your memories of that period, which is about 1989 to 93?
Well, I think 1989. I was still an art student, and I was sort of aware of these things going on. I'd heard about the Abyss, and I think I saw the Abyss on video because it didn't get a very wide release in the UK, or it came and went very, very quickly. But I guess the film that really kind of blew the doors off was Terminator 2, which came out a year or two later with the liquid metal Terminator. And again, you're seeing something that can't be done any other way. You can't make that liquid metal guy with conventional techniques. And it's allowing the filmmaker to tell a story that just wasn't possible before that. Plus,
Mm,
there's a lot of very, very clever digital compositing that's going on, and there's lots of great miniatures work and things that are happening in there. It's really extraordinary that the film again holds up completely today. And it just seems so exciting that these new possibilities were being opened up by the folks over at ILM. And then, of course, Jurassic Park comes along, and this is the introduction of the first time we see full motion digital creatures. Now, there are not that many fully digital shots of the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
no.
A lot of what you're watching is Stan Winston's extraordinary full-size T-Rex or whatever on the set, and there's incredible, practical effects that go in there. But Spielberg, is a genius filmmaker and at the height of his powers, and knows exactly when to choose the right technique. And so you pull back and you see the shot of the T-Rex stepping through the fence. That's a digital moment. Or when it's attacking the Jeep, that's a digital moment. When it's putting its face against the car, that's the practical T-Rex, and it's brilliantly mixed together. It's actually something which still is important today. Is that I think if you become over reliant on one technique, I think the audience can sometimes spot it.
Yeah.
So it's
I
it's good to mix it up.
I've always, of course, loved Jurassic Park, but it's so funny rewatching it. Sometimes I think, "Oh, I'm gonna not like I know that this is a Stan Winston
Yeah.
animatronic and then the CG," but it doesn't seem to matter, and
No, it
that's a
doesn't.
really curious thing.
Well,
It
it's
doesn't
not that
matter at all.
curious. It's just really good filmmaking. And that's
Yes.
when people say to me, "Oh, visual effects ruin films and things." I say, "No, you've just been watching a bad film." And
Yeah.
that's just bad filmmaking because the great films. I mean, I love films from the 1940s that have
Mm.
1940s visual effects in them. I love Citizen Kane, full of visual effects. That's
Yeah.
still considered to be a great film because it's a great film. That's why it's fantastic storytelling.
But I do feel like maybe one of the first films you might have even done at DNEG is
Mm,
Pitch Black,
yes,
which did have a lot of practical creatures and then digital work, but
yes,
very much that Jurassic Park mentality, right?
yeah. I mean, we started out with the intention to do a lot of animatronics in that film.
Right.
Obviously, Pitch Black had a much smaller budget than Jurassic Park. And we had an amazing physical creature team, John Cox's Creature Workshop, who had won an Oscar for Babe a year or so before that.
Mm.
But the budget was pretty tight, and they wanted to do some extraordinary things with the creatures. So the proportion of digital increased as we carried on making the film. But there is a balance between the practical and the physical effects, and of course the spacecraft that you see at the beginning, the Hunter Gratzner, named after the guys who built the model, who I
Yeah.
worked with and shared an Oscar with years later. That's all physical models. We didn't do a CG spacecraft. I think there's one little CG spacecraft done by the folks at Magic Camera at the very end of the film, but the rest of it's all practical. So that's still very much that crossover moment. And what the digital is allowing us to do with the creatures is allowing us to extend the reach of the filmmaker in what is, essentially quite a low budget movie. Some of the digital work kind of shows its age a little bit today. It's 25 years old, that film.
Mm.
If
Mm.
that's when we started making it back in 1998. But again, it comes down to just great choices by the director, and it's great filmmaking. So people still watch that movie today.
Yeah, and we've talked a bit about, obviously Star Wars is this landmark moment, and then as we get into digital visual effects, that was another technology landmark moment. I actually always think of this, and this might be sound a bit UK centric, but I
Yeah.
actually do think it was a really big thing, Paul, and you were there right in the middle of it, which was the Harry Potter phenomenon,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Especially how it brought so much work into the UK eventually. But tell me about that moment because it really pushed and pushed the visual effects industry there, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there had been an earlier attempts by the London visual effects community to really put itself on the map and say, look,
Right.
we can do big films. But really, Potter changes everything, and it's there's that wonderful term, a perfect storm. Everything happens and falls into place at the right time. You've got a phenomenally popular uh, a series of books. Everyone's very excited about it. You've got great filmmakers attaching themselves to the project. David Heyman produced it. The Chris Columbus, who directed the first two movies, obviously got a massive American studio like Warner Brothers behind it, and they're determined to keep the British flavour of it. And it's also important to know that J.K. Rowling stayed very much involved with the franchise and protected the quality and the values in the thing.
Mm,
Um, and then the first film is still largely an American affair. It's Rhythm and Hughes and Sony ImageWorks, and British companies are playing a smaller part in the process. When the second film comes along, the balance has shifted, and it's initially it's Mill Film, the first incarnation of Mill Film, and they did some amazing work with the big spiders, and I think Framestore did the giant snake dragon thing that's down in the
mm.
basement of Hogwarts. Which nobody seems to have known about until they opened the door. And then from there
Fabulous.
onwards, really starting with the third film, that's where it really shifts into high gear.
Mm,
Alfonso Cuarón comes on board. The whole series takes a different approach, a different look, which is a sort of, I think, kind of suits a sort of European sensibility. I know there's me being a little bit Eurocentric about it, but there's a sort of tradition of European filmmaking, which is perhaps a bit darker, a bit more gothic, and that's where the franchise goes at that point. That's also the first time that DNEG worked on the shows. We hadn't been on the first two films, and we did a little sequence. We did the night bus, the crazy triple decker purple
mm,
bus, which is great fun to do. Again, an amazing mixture of practical, shooting lots of plates on the streets. They had a real bus that could drive through the streets, but also using digital effects to do the squash and squeeze and all the kind of crazy stuff on the inside of the bus. And then when we get to from the fourth film onwards, we start taking a bigger role until by the time we get to Order of the Phoenix, I think DNEG ended up being the lead vendor, and I was the DNEG visual effects supervisor, working with Tim Burke, who was the overall supervisor of the show. And we did lots of scenes with Hogwarts, the Ministry of Magic. There's also Moving Picture Company and Framestore, and it's very much a increasingly a British affair
mm.
with ILM coming into the Quidditch matches because basically they'd done such a great job on the second film that Quidditch basically stayed with them for the rest of the franchise.
Right.
And it's great because I think you've got that kind of there's a sort of friendly competition going on, and we all know the other guys are going to do great stuff. So we're all
Mm.
pushing each other to do better and better work, and vie for the lead position and who has the most spectacular sequence. And I think if you look at Order of the Phoenix, you can go through it. So well, yeah, okay, there's us doing something spectacular, and there's NPC answering us, and there's Framestore doing some amazing creature work, and I think ILM did the Thestrals on that film as well. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it carries on. And so by the end of the franchise, and again, this is a sort of transition into the digital world, is that Hogwarts was done as a miniature for most of the films, but for the last movie, we switched to a digital version of the castle, which allowed us to do those extraordinary swooping shots, flying right in through the windows and chasing the Death Eaters around during the big final battle. Uh,
Mm.
so that's again, that's sort of almost like a sort of changing of guard.
It was such a landmark time in visual effects because there were so many films and then so
Mm.
many people were employed in London. I just wanted
Yes.
to bring that up.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I just
It
want to,
it really it helped. It really built the industry in London.
yeah, I want to mention to people watching, we've got about 11 minutes left on this chat, and there's some questions we will get to. But I
Yeah.
I can't not ask Paul about his time working on Chris Nolan films, partly because they were so successful
Yes.
films and also visual effects wise very successful and popular. But also, Paul, there is a current climate around practical effects and even
Mm.
Chris Nolan saying how much he loves that work. What was that experience like with you? Because I said right up the front of this stream that honestly, the visual effects person, supervisor, is usually the first hire on a Chris Nolan film or any of these big films now. And I think people would really love to know what your experience was like, given some of the
Yeah.
commentary that's been
I
going
mean,
on.
we're not quite the first hire. I mean, the production designer will come on before that
Sure.
because there's that relationship is central to the way the film develops. But yes, your visual effects increasingly is an early hire, and certainly in the films I worked on with Chris, visual effects is very much part of the conversation from the start of pre-production, and so that's very 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 important part of the process. There's I think what it is you're seeing there's a search for authenticity in film in the images that go into movies, and we've seen a lot of films which are
Mm,
essentially computer animated films with bits of live action in them. The actors tend to be live action. You can think of any big blockbuster superhero film or big sci-fi movie will often take that approach, and there's been some absolutely incredible films made that way. Avatar's probably the perfect example of that, which is just an extraordinary cultural artifact, and the way those films have just dominated the box office when they've been released, and I'm sure the next one will do the same sort of thing. And of course, the phenomenon, all the Marvel superhero films, which but there's still super important to have actual actors, so you have that emotional connection. But that search for authenticity, I think, is driving this sort of perceived backlash against computer graphics. Again, it comes down to good filmmaking versus bad filmmaking. If you're aware of the visual effects, and if they're getting in the way of you understanding the story and enjoying the film, then perhaps the right choices haven't been made. What I would say is that there's so many films out there that people watch these days, they're not just completely unaware that there's visual effects in there,
mm, mm,
because the technique and sophistication has reached a level where it's just not noticeable. And I began notice that really when we completed the work on Batman Begins. There's so much work in there that just dovetails seamlessly with the live action, with the models, with the physical effects, with the live action performances. The audience didn't appear to be, and the critics didn't appear to be aware of when we were going to digital. And I think what Chris brought to the process, from my initially, was that he raised the bar for me in terms of the quality level that I was aiming at, because the guy's got X-ray vision and can see every tiny flaw in your work that you might have got away with another filmmaker, but not so with Chris. The
mm,
level of scrutiny he applies to things is extraordinary. But also, he brings you into the process in that you're on set, you're with the guys who are doing the physical part of the film. You're not just sitting in some high-tech control room surrounded by screens. You're physically there with everybody else. And Chris wants to put as much reality in front of the camera as possible, because that sets the basis of his film. And the visual effects work will build upon that. So we'll always be using that as a reference. Even if we're replacing it completely and doing an entirely digital image, it takes its lead from the live action. And that even applies to something like Interstellar. So sometimes when we were looking at the black hole, which is a completely computer generated image, we may have put a giant 20K light up on the set and shone it into the camera to give us
mm,
that incredible optical burnout and the flares and everything and what have you. And then we'll start with that and use that as the basis to build the shot. So you're starting with a grounding in some sort of optical reality. And then, of course, we spent all that time trying to figure out the physics and make the physics authentic. So it's an actual simulation of the way the black hole looks. And that was
yeah,
also very important to the process as well. And it's not true at all to say that Chris despises visual effects. That's the sort of kind of thing you hear. It's just silly. You can find plenty of examples of Chris, crediting the visual effects crews from all the films that he's made online. And Andrew Jackson has been a very important part of making Oppenheimer. He's the DNEG visual effects
yeah.
supervisor for all VFX Soup who did that show. And but I'm so grateful I had that experience of working with Chris and working with his crew, because I learned so much about how you create cinematic images. And that experience of being on set, seeing those enormous physical set pieces, flying in the helicopter down the street through Pittsburgh to chase the Batmobile, that informs the way I look at even entirely digital shots. I can look at something and say, well, that's not how a helicopter moves. And I can tell you because I've been in one doing exactly the same thing, or
Yeah.
whatever. So yeah, it was an immense privilege to have been part of those films.
Oh, that's great. All right, we've got hardly any time, but I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. Someone asked about, as a director now, do
hmm
you find yourself tweaking your vision or direction to facilitate the VFX work? Quick answer to that, Paul.
No, not really. You always start with the story first, and then you figure out what you need to do to support it. And it may be that you suddenly say, "Oh, I can make it bigger and better by doing this extra thing in visual effects." But I don't know. I wouldn't ever say that I've written something or directed something to take advantage of a visual effects moment. It's driven primarily by the story first and foremost.
Right. Awesome. Um, Someone wants to know how you see the role of the compositor changing in the coming years.
Well, obviously there's all this new AI stuff that's coming out, and I've been looking at some of the AI tools which can add incredible detail to things. At the moment, they only really work on still images. There are some motion
Mm,
tools, but they're not good enough to use in filmmaking yet. Whatever anybody says, but I do think it will change things. I think what it'll do is it'll extend the reach, just as digital tools allowed us to do more in the same amount of time. This will do the same thing. But the important thing is not to allow yourself to be led down arbitrary pathways by the software. I always say this about any digital software. If you want to be a great digital visual effects artist, you need to figure out how to project your ideas through the software so what comes out on the screen looks like your intention. And it isn't just some arbitrary choice which was made by a software engineer of how Chrome or Fire or whatever should look, because the software will do a lot of things for you. And AI just amplifies that massively. And it's very easy to get totally beguiled by these very slick images coming out of tools like Midjourney and Firefly. And you say, wow, I'm an amazing artist. Look what I just created. Because actually, what you're doing is you're scraping together loads of other people's ideas and it's getting all munged up. And it can be really interesting visually, but it's also it's seductive because it has such a level of polish to it. And you have to keep
mm.
asking yourself, does this image earn its place in my story? Is it doing what I, or have I just been fooled into it by have I had my head turned by a pretty face? That's what you need to that's what you need to ask yourself as a filmmaker.
That's a great answer. Probably the last question. Justin in Queensland, who works at a university, has asked, as educators, how do we connect the importance of those key moments that we discussed, which are literally 50 years old or
Yeah.
longer, with modern tools and techniques for new students, with new
Well, it's
students?
again, it comes down to the storytelling. If you were going to redo the attack on the Death Star today, I think it might have more shots in it because you could afford to have more cuts, and you wouldn't maybe hold the takes quite so long. And modern filmmaking is much more cutty than Star Wars, if
Mm,
you think about
mm,
that. But I think the actual intention of the filmmakers would still be largely the same. You might have a more, the different effects might look different. Like the destruction of the Death Star would probably be something, big spectacular CGI moment with all sorts of bits and bobs flying out at the camera. But I think it largely stay the same. The important thing is the intent of the filmmakers and the quality of the storytelling and the way that it pulls you in. Again, there's a reason why we still watch Episode 4, A New Hope, 50 years, nearly 50 years after the fact. This is a
mm.
reason why we still watch 2001. There's a reason why I still watch films like The Thief of Baghdad and A Matter of Life and Death or The Red Shoes, because they are just great bits of visual storytelling. And the fact that those films, the ones I just mentioned, are over 80 years old. The original King Kong is 90 years old. There's a reason why we still watch
Amazing.
these. They're just great bits of visual storytelling, and that those lessons are just as important to somebody using modern digital tools turbocharged by AI as they were to somebody struggling with a two-head optical printer back in 1933.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for your great questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but Paul has done such a great job of summing up a few of them all in one go, especially relating to AI, which is the
Yes.
topic of the moment.
Yeah.
I really
Something.
enjoyed chatting about those key moments in VFX history, Paul, because I think some of them are mine as well, of course.
Yeah, thank
Uh,
you. Ian. No, it's always a pleasure to chat with you about visual effects. I could go on all day, as you can probably tell.
no, I loved it.